The first thing that I'd like to make a case for is that you bring to bear on the world an a priori perceptual structure. And that's really an embodied structure, and it's a consequence of the 3.5 billion years that you've spent putting your body together, which is a tremendous amount of time. And not only your body, but your mind, of course, because your mind is part of your body and very much embedded within it. You know, you tend to think that you have your brain in your head and it's sort of floating separate from the rest of your body, but it's not really true. You're a tremendous, massive system of neurons running through your entire body, autonomic. There's more neurons in the autonomic nervous system than there are in the central nervous system, so that's a lot of neurons. And then your central nervous system, of course, enables you to exercise voluntary control over your musculature and also to receive information from it. Your brain is really distributed through your body. One of the things you may not know is that people who are paraplegic can walk if you suspend them above a treadmill. Their legs will walk by themselves with no voluntary control. So your spine is capable of quite complex activity. In fact, when you walk, mostly it's a controlled fall, and mostly your spine is doing it. And so anyways, the point of all that is that you don't have a blank slate consciousness that's interpreting a world that manifests itself as segregated objects in some straightforward sense. You have a built-in interpretive system that's extraordinarily deeply embedded and invisible, because you might think about it as the implicit structure of your unconscious. It's what gives rise to your conscious experience, and it presents you with the world. That's one way of thinking about it. And it's a good way of thinking about it. It's the psychoanalytic way of thinking about it, as well as the neuroscientific way of thinking about it, because one of the things that's pretty interesting about modern neuroscientists, especially the top-rate ones, and those are usually the ones that are working on emotions, as far as I've been able to tell, are often quite enamored of the psychoanalyst. Jaak Panksepp was a good example of that, because they came to understand that the psychoanalysts' insistence on underlying unconscious personified motivations was actually an accurate reflection of how the brain worked. And so to think of yourself as a loose collection of autonomous spirits that's governed by some overarching identity is a reasonable way of thinking about it. The question is, or a question that arises from that is, what is the nature of this a priori structure that you use to interpret the world? And I think the clearest answer to that is that it's a story, that you live inside a story. And that's very, very interesting to me, because I believe, and I have a couple of videos that lay this out, I believe that Darwinian presuppositions are at least as fundamental as Newtonian presuppositions. I actually think they're more fundamental, and that the fact that we've evolved story-like structures through which to interpret the world indicates to me that there's something deeply true about story-like structures. Or they're true at least insofar as the fact that we've developed them means that here we are living, and that it's taken 3.5 billion years to develop them. They're highly functional. And so we don't have much better definition of truth than highly functional. You know, that's about as good as it gets, partly because we're limited creatures and we don't have omniscient knowledge, and so the best we can do with our knowledge, generally speaking, is to note its functionality and improve it when it fails to work properly. I think the scientific method actually does that. And so the fact that we've evolved a story-like structure through which to interpret the world, that's pretty damn interesting. It says something fundamental about stories, and it's strange in the same way that the fact that we have hemispheric specialization for the known and the unknown, or for chaos and order and chaos, respectively, also says something fundamental about the nature of the world. If you assume that, we've evolved to reflect the structure of the world, broadly speaking, and that's obviously not just the physical structure, the atoms and the molecules, but all of the patterned manifestations of the physical molecules as they build structures of increasing complexity across time. That would include human interactions and political interactions, economic interactions, familial interactions, all of those things that are a very important part of our reality, but perhaps in some sense not as fundamental as the physical attributes that the physicists concentrate on. So we live in stories. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about stories and about their structure. Because when you understand a little bit about the structure of stories, then a whole array of things about mythology all of a sudden make overwhelming sense. And it's so useful because what you see is that many of the things that are standard occurrences in your life, everyone's life, that are portrayed universally in mythology. And it's very helpful because, first of all, it de-isolates you. One of the things you learn as a clinical psychologist, contra the anti-psychiatrists, let's say, is that diagnosis is often a relief to people. You know, there's a problem with being diagnosed because then you might be labeled and then the label can follow you for the rest of your life. And once you're labeled as something, then strange things happen around you that often reinforce that label. Maybe you start acting it out more or you adopt it as an identity. But there's a flip side of that, which is that the last thing that you ever want to hear when you go see a physician or a psychologist is, you know, I've never seen a case like yours before. Right, that is not a relief, man, because if the message is I've never heard anything like what you're telling me, the outcome is either going to be not so good for you or you're not going to get listened to at all, right? Because you're such an anomaly that your existence is annoying to the integrated knowledge structure of the medical professional that you're attempting to receive advice from. Well, it's definitely the case because, you know, if you can be put in a box, then the box tells the doctor what to do with you, and that's actually a relief to the doctor, but also a relief to you, right? Because you want to know, so you come and you say, look, I can't go out of my house much anymore. I'm afraid on elevators. I have heart palpitations, and sometimes I end up in the emergency room. Increasingly, my interactions in the world are restricted. I find myself staying at home. I'm afraid I'm going to die of a heart attack. And the psychologist says, well, you have agoraphobia. It's like lots of people have that, and here's usually how it develops, and here's the treatment course, and you know, we can probably do something about that. And it's like, well, you're not going to die of a heart attack now, probably. That's a real relief. You're not crazy in a completely unique way, and you're crazy in a way that might be treatable, you know. And it's such a relief because people come in there with a pile of snakes of indeterminate magnitude, and they walk out with one manageable snake, and it's still a snake, but you know, one manageable snake beats a hydra, right? So, all right, so back to stories. So, the stories that we tell and that we live in are fundamentally ways that we deal with the complexity of the world. And the fundamental problem with the world, as far as I can tell, is that not only is it complex beyond your comprehension, but the complexity shifts in unpredictable ways. So that's the Darwinian conundrum, actually. That's why Darwinism seems to be a practical necessity with regards to the continuation of life, because the complexity changes unpredictably, you can't necessarily tell what's going to work in the future. And so the Darwinian process solves that by generating quasi-random variations and letting whichever one by happenstance happens to work in that environment survive. Now, it's not random precisely because the underlying structure is conserved. It's very rare that a child would be born with an extra arm or something like that. And like the skeletal structure that you inhabit is shared by animals going way, way back in evolutionary history. There's a lot of conservation in the evolutionary process, but so there's variation within conservation. Like music. It's a good way of thinking about it.